and we belonged to our congregation that was very small. So small, in fact, that for the first many years of my life, we met in a Unitarian church. And we shared space with them, except for when there was a bingo night and other things when we got kicked out because the church had to do its own fundraising, in which case we would host synagogue in my living room. So this is, in some ways, it feels like I'm coming home. When we grew big enough, we no longer met in the church, but we rented a space in a business park and had services very similar to this one. In fact, my bar mitzvah was in a room that feels almost identical to this. A bar mitzvah being when I turned 13, in case people didn't understand. That's a coming-of-age ceremony in our tradition. And then when I got to high school and almost to college, we purchased a building. And it took a little while to get into that building. I never saw that building until I was in college, but I understand the tapestry is getting very close to that place too. So congratulations on forming a beautiful, welcoming community that seems to be drawing people together and moving to the next phase of your religious life. So that's really quite amazing. And again, like I said, it feels a little bit like I'm coming home. I've been asked to speak about my work this morning and to speak for my tradition. So I'm going to be speaking from the Jewish tradition, and I hope that you find some meaning in it as I share these words. Several years ago, I live in a big city, and several years ago, we used to live about a mile from our congregation, and as an observant Jew, I would walk to synagogue on Shabbat morning, because we don't drive on our Sabbath. We don't use fire and all sorts of other things. So I used to walk, and in order to walk, I'd have to walk down Ventura Boulevard, and I'd have to cross under a freeway to get to my congregation. And for years, until this day, there are people that live under that freeway and where the freeway meets Ventura Boulevard. And over the course of time, I began to get to know a particular individual. And for the sake of anonymity, I'll call him Jack. That's what I call him when I describe him to people. And at first he waved to me, and I really wasn't sure how to respond. And then eventually we began to have these kind of like silent hellos where we begin to talk to each other, but not really speak to each other. And over the course of time, it became okay to speak to each other. And I would spend a couple minutes with him on the way to synagogue in the morning, and after fellowship, when the services were over, I would bring him some food on the way back. And over the course of time, we got to know each other a bit. And I found out that Jack was a veteran, and he ended up where he was, living where he did on the side of the street, because he was in war, and when he came home, he was traumatized so much that he couldn't maintain a job. He couldn't maintain a living, and he used alcohol and drugs to quiet his mind enough so that he could fall asleep at night. But we all know that what happens when you get into a cycle of depression and then you drug your way out of that depression, and then you get into a manic state, and then you lose your friends, and you lose your family, and you lose their good graces, and you end up leaving your own apartment and ending up on someone's couch or on someone's floor or in someone's guest room, but then you burn through your hospitality because you are not yet dealt with the actual trauma that is inside of you, and you go from couch to couch to couch to the back of your car to a tent on the side of the street. That is how most people become homeless. And so over the course of several months, we got to know each other until one day at the end of August, a hot day, I was coming home and I saw him, and he was in the back of a squad car. And behind the squad car was a sanitation truck. And they had arrested him, and they were throwing all of the things he had left in the world away. And I tried to ask the police officer where they were taking him and why he was being arrested, and all he said is the hotel next door was uncomfortable with him being around. Guests were making comments in the lobby, and it was time to take Jack away. That process by now is illegal. You can't do that anymore. But a few years ago, it was legal. And I thought a lot about him, and it really spurred me to action. And the first thing I thought of was that the homeless in our community, many of us just don't even see them. It's sort of a sense of moral blindness that we have. That they're a tax that we pay, just like our income tax or a sales tax. This is our human tax for living in a city. You walk down the street and you see a tree, you see a bus stop, you see a bench, you see a trash can, you see a homeless person, you see another tree. They just blend into the background as if it's just part of who we are living in a city. We're willing to pay in flesh and blood in order to sort of be sanguine about the fact that we live with such economic disparity, with such trauma in our midst, the cost of which, of course, is human life. But we just don't see them. And I didn't really see them until I got to know Jack. I didn't really see any homeless person until I began to put a face to one, and then a name to one, and then a story to one, and then suddenly, as if you had woken up from a long dream, you begin to see them everywhere. You see them at the end of freeways, on on-ramps and off-ramps. If you look carefully, you'll see them in parking lots, sleeping in cars, as we read in this morning. You see them in all corners of society. Unless you look for them, most of them don't want to be seen, and unless you look for them, you cannot see them. But many of us can't see them not because they are hidden, but because our own moral blindness prevents ourselves from seeing them. And so in that moment when I saw Jack ripped away from the last shreds of life, last shreds of dignity that he had, I knew we had to do something. And so I gave a sermon about homelessness in our congregation, and I said essentially what it means to be a human being in the world is not to have moral blindness, but to wake up. We should be in praise of being insomniacs. We should not worry about falling asleep all the time, because living in a society means that we have a responsibility to each other. This reading from Deuteronomy, this beautiful reading from Deuteronomy, which animates so much of our tradition. Cherish was saying, she was at my in-laws for Seder. It's the core reading that we read at a Seder festival on the eve of Passover, which basically says that when you get to the land, in the book of Deuteronomy, as Moses speaks to the people, he says, "This is my dream for you. This is what I'd like you to know. This is how I'd like you to think. This is what's inside your heart. When you get to the land, you will be okay. You will have a farm. You will have a family. You will make money. You will be prosperous. You might even have a club membership or drive a nice car. Or you might even be able to go out to eat once in a while. You'll be okay. But once a year, you have to come home. You have to come to Jerusalem, and you have to bring the bounty of your first fruits, because those you owe back to God. And when you come with your basket draped in gold and ribbon and fruits and beauty, you will ascend the mountain of the Lord, and you will come before the priest, and the priest will look you square in the face and ask you the most important question that is asked in the Torah itself, which is, who are you? Who are you now that you have become successful? Who are you now that you have a home? Who are you now that you have children? Who are you now that you have a place in the world and a bed for your head? Who are you as a human being? And the answer is not just, my name is Noah and I live in Encino and I have a home and a family and I have enough food to eat. That's not the answer to the question. Because when the Torah asks us a question, it doesn't want us to give the most obvious answer. The question, who are you, is, who are you really on the inside? And then Moses says, this is what you shall say. You shall say, my father was a wandering Aramean, a homeless man, who went down to Egypt and became oppressed. And only after 400 years of slavery were we able to get out. And when God brought us out with an outstretched arm and a mighty hand and brought us to this place and gave us prosperity, only then can I say, with a land flowing of milk and honey, that I am going to share my bounty with the Levite, with the orphan, with the widow, with those who live at the margin of society. Deep inside the heart of a Jew and deep inside of each one of our hearts as human beings is the knowledge and understanding that our identities doesn't end or doesn't begin with our birth and doesn't end with our death. Our identities transcend history. They transcend geography. They transcend spirituality and traditions, because each inside and every one of us is a heart of a homeless person. That our most ancient way of identifying who we are as an individual is by saying, my forefather was a wandering Aramean, a fugitive, a refugee, someone who was looking for a home. Who are you is the question. And the answer is that we are Adam and Eve, who were kicked out of the garden, made homeless by the fall, and had to make a life outside of Eden. Who are you? We are Abraham, who wandered across the known world looking for purpose, away from his father's house, away from the place where he was born, homeless only to find God in the desert. Who are you? We are Jacob, who in his own life had to flee from his house because of the choices he made, fearful of his brother, homeless again in order to make a life in another place. Who are you? We are Joseph, who has been cast into the pit, ostracized for his brothers because he was different from them, sold into slavery, becoming homeless, and then rising to become the second most powerful man in the world. Who are you? We are Moses himself, who, after understanding that his call to justice led him to try to advocate for slaves, had to flee Egypt for an entire lifetime, wandering in the desert to find his purpose again in the world. Who are you? We are all these people. We are all these individuals who have a homeless heart. Los Angeles, where I live, has the dubious distinction of being the homelessness capital of the United States. Every night in LA County, there are nearly 60,000 people who don't have a place to live. So what is 60,000 people? That's more than can fill Staples Center. That's actually more than the attendance at Game 1 of the World Series next week. Chavez Ravine can't hold 60,000 people. We have an entire stadium worth of people who sleep on the street every night. The majority of whom, 75% of whom, are families. They might be single individuals, but they don't have chronic disease. They're not schizophrenics. They're not people who are villains and criminals. They are people who can't make ends meet. They are veterans who fall short of their, where we have fallen short of our commitment to them, and that they have now ended up on the street because of a terrible cycle of depression and addiction. They are families, like we read about the woman in the car this morning, who live and have children who are on the streets and live with them, and they don't want to be separated from their kids. And unfortunately, until recently, much of the shelter system separated families because they felt like the state could take better care of their kids than their parents did, re-traumatizing families in the midst of their darkest hour. The majority of those who are homeless, thank God, are homeless for a year or less. But 1 year on the streets creates a lifetime of depression, of trauma. We have shown that out of the foster care system in Los Angeles County, you have two options. You can become homeless or you can become incarcerated. 60% of men between the ages of 18 and 24, most of whom are African American, who are incarcerated, come out of the foster care system. And when they leave incarceration, guess where they end up? On the streets. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. Homelessness, more than any other issue in social society, is responsive to resources. We know this from across the country. You raise the money to build shelters and you give people homes, guess what? They're no longer homeless. You raise money for social services, for addiction counseling, for social workers, and you give them an opportunity to break the cycle of addiction and depression. They begin to stabilize themselves, get decent paying jobs, and then they are no longer homeless. You create living wage campaigns that prevent people from becoming homeless because they're able to afford the apartments in which they live. You build affordable housing and require developers to create affordable housing, and now you can prevent homelessness because people can stay in their homes and they don't have to end up on a couch or in the back of a car or on the street. Homelessness is a solvable problem. It's one of the few problems we know that we can have, or we can solve it. We can end it. We can end this crisis. And that's the work that Cherish was saying that I've been working on for the last several years. The coalition that I helped to build has moved $5 billion in 5 years in LA County to try to address the homelessness crisis. And that's because we believe inside every one of us, every human being, man, woman, child, anything in between, inside every one of us, our core identity, we must know, is that we have a homeless heart. In the Torah, it says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. It says you should see yourself as if you were a slave in Egypt again. And the reason for that is not because we should just have this identity, but because then it says, do not oppress the stranger, the orphan, the widow, those who live at the margins, those who are poor, those who don't yet have a home, that the chain of pain that goes from one generation to the next must end with you, and it must end with me. And that takes commitment. And that commitment begins in an understanding that each of us has a homeless heart. I could tell you dozens of stories. I've been doing this for 10 years. And in 10 years of working in social justice work, I can tell you I am more sensitive now to stories of suffering than I was 10 years ago. Despite what they tell you about experience, and despite what they tell you about how to be a pastor, where you're not supposed to feel all the feelings, where you're not supposed to be invested in the story of the person you're trying to help, where you're supposed to keep a distance or stay strong for someone else, it's just not the truth. The truth is, the more sensitive you are, the more open your heart is, the more you can do, because feeling leads to action. There's a story of Sam, whose story is similar to the one in the book that we read. Sam is a man, though, and he kept his child. His wife was the addict who succumbed to her addiction and couldn't take care of their child. And rather than running away as a young African-American man, he decided he was going to stick it out. Except that there are no shelters in LA that take fathers and children. They only take mothers and children. And Sam slept in a friend's car until the car disappeared. It wasn't stolen, mind you. The car never worked. The car never moved. The car's engine didn't work. The car was towed. And there's only two people who can tow cars in Los Angeles: a business owner for whom the car is parked illegally, and the government. His friend's car was towed by the government. Sam ended up in a shelter. He ended up in a new type of shelter, this permanent supportive housing that we've been pushing to create. It's a studio apartment with a lock and a key and a kitchen and a bathroom and a bed and a window. We know from Utah, we know from Houston, we know from Chicago that in all of those places, when you give someone a shelter first, they're suddenly more amenable to social services. You shouldn't have to earn your way to a house. Housing should be a right and not a privilege. It's not a badge that you earn through a process. It's the keys to the door that gets you to become a human being again, like the story of Sabrina. Sabrina was a woman I met a couple years ago who was formerly homeless. She said the worst thing she ever experienced as being a homeless woman was being sexually violated by other men. And then she said the second most worst thing is that people wouldn't even look her in the face. And she felt more alone in the world being a woman on the streets than she did even in the process of being raped. Because she was alone and there was no one who knew her name, no one would look her in the face. She felt exiled from her own community. When she found services and was able to become into an apartment of her own, and she was stabilized, and she was given the right kind of care that she needed. And people would just say, "Good morning, Sabrina." She felt human for the first time in decades. And so I stand here in front of you today telling you that I think that the future of trying to solve homelessness begins with each one of us, each one of you. It begins in a very simple place. It's not your responsibility to build a house. It's not your responsibility to create social services, unless that's the government's responsibility that you should be pushing for. But it is your responsibility. It's your responsibility to say hello, to look them in the eye, and to smile. You don't have to give them money. You don't have to give them food. You don't have to give them anything unless your heart is moved to do that. But what you have to do is treat them like a human being. If they want to talk to you, if you have the time, make conversation. If they want to say hello, you say hello back. If they ask you for money and you're not willing to give, just say no thank you. They deserve at least that. The rabbis ask a very important question. They ask, where's the Messiah? 2,000 years of exile, 2,000 years of oppression, 2,000 years of being on the heel of society. They ask, when is the Messiah finally going to come? Where is the Messiah? And a great sage stood up and says, the Messiah is already here. Well, then where is the Messiah? The rabbi asks, and his colleague says, the Messiah is at the gate of the city with the lepers, bandaging and rebandaging those people that have been dejected from society. Well, then why won't the Messiah come into the city? If he's right there, why won't he come into the city? To which the tradition answers, the Messiah will come on the day that the Messiah is welcomed. The Messiah will come on the day that the Messiah is no longer needed. The Messiah will come when the world in which the Messiah will walk is one in which the Messiah is already comfortable walking. We can pray for a beautiful future. We can pray for justice and for peace. But we have to create the world in which God wants to live. And that, my friends, is our responsibility. Thank you so much for having me here. It is so great to be here with such wonderful people. Thank you again, and thank you to Cherish for inviting me for being here.